This little monster is a Friedman Runt 50, and it came in because the owner said that the dirty channel was too bright, more on that in a little bit, and that the clean channel was not clean. It was going into overdrive really quickly. Here's what that sounded like. Now, as soon as I heard that, I knew what was up. A little backstory for you. Now, Dave Friedman and I are friendly, and we talk from time to time. And I know a lot of other guys in the industry whose last names are on amplifiers, and we all talk. And one of the things we talk about is when we run into bad batches of parts that are supposed to be good that fail. And when they fail, it makes us look bad because the client usually does not understand that we do not, in fact, make the capacitors. We do not, in fact, make the resistors. We do not, in fact, make any of the things typically that are in the amp. We choose from what's available commercially, what has the specs and tolerances that we need, and at X price. We make the best judgment call we can. And sometimes that bites us on the butt. Let me show you what happened here. This is an axial electrolytic capacitor. And like most of them on the market, it has a vented end at one end and a solid end at the other. F&Ts are built the same way. Sprague atoms are built the same way. Most caps are built like this. Friedman often uses these ARS caps, which are normally just fine, but he got a batch which had venting on one end and venting on the other end. And the ones which have venting at both ends tend to fail on him. The ones he gets now, the majority of the ones he gets are built the same way with the vent at one end and solid at the other, and he's not having problems, but he had problems with this batch. So let me show you what the fix was. Dave had me replace all 5 electrolytic caps with these F&Ts, which do not have a problem. And that sound that you heard when the clean was distorting was this filter cap just totally failing, and there was not any filtering or decoupling between nodes, and so just terrible, terrible overdrive. Now, what's really nice about this is that Dave didn't just have me change out these filter caps in this 3-year-old amp out of warranty. He also had me change all the silver micas that he had been using before to these 562 series ceramic discs because he'd had problems with the silver micas, occasionally failing, just occasionally. Even though this particular amp is past its factory warranty, Dave wanted me to treat it as a warranty repair because he'd had that issue with these bad ARS caps. So I replaced the filter caps. I replaced the silver micas. I made a few other tweaks to bring it up to its current spec. There have been a few changes to this model over the years, and I performed those for this amp, which will also take care of the drive channel being too bright. In a little bit, you'll get a chance to hear the fixed clean channel and the fixed or modified overdrive. But first, I want to bore you with some tech stuff. After I did all that, the amp sounded pretty good, but didn't sound quite right to me. I putted around and I had found that the level going into the effects return was not the same as the level going to the phase inverter, and they should have been the same. I did some more snooping around and I talked to Dave, and I found that a non-original component in the makeup gain stage of the effects loop was the wrong value. So that's all fixed, and the amp is back to full output. I mention that because people often say, hey, do you not use a scope? I never see you use a scope. I do use a scope. I use a scope all the time. It's just not always necessary with a simple tube amp repair, and a lot of the times what I use a scope for does not make for a very interesting video. I did use it here to trace where the signal was being lost through the amp, particularly because it was happening within a solid state effects loop. Great solid state effects loop. Just one component had been changed for the wrong value. And then after that, I confirmed everything was operating properly and it had the correct output wattage. Let me show you that. All right, here I've got a 1 kilohertz. I believe I've got 240-ish millivolts, just under 300 millivolts feeding it, 280 millivolts feeding the input on the clean channel. And let me set the treble and bass flat on that and make sure the presence is there. You can see the presence changes the waveform. So I'm going to change the presence until I get a really nice clean waveform. Notice something I want to show you. That looks like crossover distortion, and someone might try to bias that out, bias the amp until that goes away. And if you do that, you can end up over biasing your amp. So you gotta turn that presence till you get a nice symmetrical looking waveform. About noon. All right, so with the waveform at noon, everything looks great. That's with 1K feeding it, which is how we nominally do this kind of thing. If I were to increase the frequency, however, let's go up. See, it begins to square off there. That's not clean anymore, and it's not clean now at 1.56K. If I go back down to 1K, which is where we nominally take measurements, it's clean. If I drop below that, let's go down to like 400 hertz. It's clean. Whoa, check it out, man. So the right began to square off right there about 1.4K. We don't really measure higher. And that's going to be affected again by the presence. I can turn the presence all the way down, the squaring goes away, turn the presence way up, it gets much more square, because those are the frequencies where it's canceling negative feedback, and so it's not as clean there. So that's one of the reasons we tend to measure at 1K, and turn it back down to 1K. Doesn't have to be precise. Turn the presence back up to noon. That's a pretty good place to be. Now with it clean, nice clean waveforms, top and bottom, pretty symmetrical. You're not seeing the big crossover distortions, and I can zoom in on that if I want to. That's close enough for rock and roll. This is not a hi-fi amp. This is not someone's stereo rig. Let me turn the input gain on the amp up until it begins to square off. Right there. You can see it beginning to square a little bit, then a lot. Right about there, where the top of the waveform isn't quite as thick. That's a pretty good place to be. So I got 17.5 RMS. Let me go up a little bit more. I think I can finesse that a little bit more. Sometimes it's good to be zoomed out a little bit more, zoomed in a little bit more. Thin it out a little bit. All right, that's about as high as I can go. I still have everything cleaned up. So let's say 19.3. It's varying a little bit. All right, I'm gonna go to my calculator. That's RMS, not peak to peak, by the way. So 19.3 squared divided by the 8 ohm dummy load, 46.56 watts. Now, depending on how I measure this, I can make this thing louder and quieter than that. So if I turn the presence up, notice RMS goes up and we haven't peaked yet. So in the 1K range, the RMS changes quite dramatically with the presence. You can choose to get this, what our ears perceive as clean, which would be like about there on the presence and there-ish. Let's see, right before that square wave. Depending on how I measure this, at what frequency, I've gotten everywhere from the current 47 watts output, clean output, to 55 watts clean output. And all the knob positions affect that to a degree. You're not going to hear any difference between a 47 and a 52 watt amp, but that is within the healthy range, and most people are not running this amp clean anyway, so this is like the least musically interesting clean it can get. All that stuff there with the crossover notches, that's where the presence all the way brightest. We tend to like that kind of thing. Now, some of this is going to be over most people's heads. And some of this, someone's going to argue with because I'm not spending 30 minutes proving everything that I'm saying. If I turn the gain up, it goes square wave city. It would sound great when we play guitar through that, just not to measure it. So I don't put scopes on the videos very often because they don't tell the general public much that they need to know. And it really opens up a can of worms for all the anoraks to say, well, have you tried this methodology or that methodology? And this is not a tech. This is not a channel for other techs. This is not a, hey, let's discuss how physics works channel. This is a how amps work for guitarists, how to make your amp last longer, et cetera, et cetera. The primary purpose of this video is to show that Dave's a good guy and he stands behind his products. But at the same time, I thought I would show that, yes, I do have a scope and I know how to use it. And there are so many variables here, it just gets really in the weeds. It's faster for me to just do it than to tell you what I'm doing or why. Anyway, let's move on to the fun part, getting to hear it. So that was the clean and the dirty sound now. And the clean is very loud and very clean. And the dirty channel, due to the version updates Dave had me perform, no longer is very bright. You can still get some nice treble bite to it, but it can also be very smooth. That last bit you heard was bridge. All this was with the SG. I didn't have time to grab the Strat for this. Now, before I end this, I want to make sure all the pots are tight to the front chassis. They can get loose over time. I just want to make sure this thing's bulletproof. Let me show you one last thing before we end this video. Look how chewed up this poor fuse holder is. That's what happens when someone grabs the wrong size screwdriver and it's lots of slack in that slot and it just chews it up. Use the right size screwdriver. Always. Just like I've shown removing chassis screws, you have to match the screwdriver bit to the screw or you damage things. But that's enough talking about amps for the time being. I'm going to let you go and enjoy your day. I'm going to get on to the next amp in the queue.